In a jaw-dropping moment that stunned the nation, Rachel Maddow took a public swipe at actor and faith leader Jonathan Roumie, telling him on live television to go back to preaching on sound stages. But Jonathan's calm, deeply human response left the room in silence, and millions watching in tears. The video dives into this explosive exchange, how it happened, how it shattered the image of quiet compliance, and why it's now dominating headlines across America. It began during a nationally televised panel in Washington, D.C. The room was packed. Reporters, cultural critics, and political strategists buzzed in the background. Cameras rolled. On the panel sat several influential figures, media powerhouses, politicians, commentators. But one name drew every eye, Rachel Maddow. She fidgeted in her seat, her smile tight, her tone sharper than usual. Across from her sat Jonathan Roumie, composed, humble, gentle, the kind of presence that calms a storm by simply refusing to feed it. He sat in silence, as he often does, listening. The moderator asked a simple question: what role should faith play in modern American dialogue? Rachel Maddow's smile thinned. Still bitter after her recent viral clash with a conservative bishop on her nightly show, she leaned forward with casual cruelty. "Let's be honest," she said, her voice smooth and slicing. "We don't need actors playing Jesus on streaming platforms and then pretending they belong in real conversations about democracy. Jonathan, maybe it's time you go back to whatever biblical sound stage you came from." Gasps. The audience recoiled. Even seasoned producers behind the cameras froze. The camera zoomed in on Jonathan's face. He didn't blink, didn't flinch, but something in the room shifted. What Rachel didn't realize, what millions were about to learn, was that the quiet man across from her wasn't going to stay silent anymore. Not today. Not when truth was on trial. The room fell still. The moderator stammered, attempting to steer the discussion back, but the damage was done. The wound had been struck, and the world was watching. Jonathan Roumie sat motionless for a few seconds, his eyes lowered, not in shame but in deep, prayerful composure. Then he slowly lifted his head. His voice, when it came, was soft, yet it cut through the air like a hymn sharpened by fire. "Ms. Maddow," he said, gently placing his hand on the mic, "I may speak about God, but I do not speak with arrogance." A beat. The room froze again. Even Rachel's trademark smirk faltered. Jonathan continued, steady and clear. "You think because I'm gentle, I am weak. But gentleness is not the absence of strength. It's the control of it. In faith, real faith, is not a performance. It's a calling." A second wave of gasps echoed through the crowd. His words didn't just defend himself. They unveiled a pain, a depth, a dignity that had long been ignored. And then, his voice sharpened. "Before you accuse me of pretending to belong here, perhaps take a closer look at the roles you've played, Ms. Maddow, and ask yourself, before America does, were you speaking for truth or for applause?" The flash of cameras was immediate. The world was no longer just watching, it was listening. Rachel chuckled, but too quickly. She waved her hand in the air dismissively. "Oh, come on, Jonathan," she said with forced levity. "Let's not turn this into a sermon." But her voice cracked, and everyone noticed. Jonathan, still poised, didn't even smile. "This is not a sermon," he said, barely above a whisper. "This is my life, my mission, my testimony." Then instead of looking at Rachel, he looked directly into the camera. "I didn't come to this country to act. I came to serve, to build, to tell stories that heal. I work hard, I follow the law, and I love this nation with every fiber of my soul." Whispers swept across the room. Some clapped, others stared in disbelief. Rachel shifted uncomfortably in her seat, and Jonathan leaned forward just slightly. "Ms. Maddow," he said, his voice suddenly filled with quiet fire, "what have you done besides tear people down while pretending to lift them up?" That line cut through the stage like scripture spoken in defiance of power. It wasn't just Rachel who felt it. Every viewer did. Every person who had once written him off as just an actor now saw something else, a lion in sheep's clothing. For years, Jonathan Roumie had been labeled a religious performer, a man with a mission, maybe, but never a force, never a threat. But now the cameras turned. The crowd leaned in, and Rachel Maddow, who had started this with a smirk, suddenly looked very small. Jonathan never raised his voice. He didn't need to, because sometimes the loudest power is a truth whispered by a man with nothing to prove. He had awakened something, and though he stood there as one man, what rose behind him was not ego, but a movement. And that movement had claws not of violence, but of quiet grace and unstoppable truth. As Jonathan Roumie returned to his seat, the hall was wrapped in silence. Not awkward, not empty, sacred. It swept through the crowd like a hush before revelation. Everyone felt it, deep in their bones. Something had just shifted in the soul of America. No one expected what came next. A woman in the front row, a congressional aide with a military background, discreetly wiped a tear from her cheek. Then slowly an older man stood up. His back was slightly hunched, his hand trembling. On his head, a Vietnam veteran cap. He began to clap. Once, twice, deliberately. Then others joined in, hesitant at first, then stronger. Not a political cheer, not applause for a party or platform. This was for courage. This was for someone who had just stood on truth, with elegance, conviction, and unshakable dignity. Rachel Maddow, still seated, scanned the room, confused, frustrated. This wasn't the narrative she had come for. She had prepared a takedown, but what she had accidentally done was ignite a national reckoning. Meanwhile, Jonathan remained still. No gloating, no smirk. But as the applause grew louder, a single tear slid down his cheek. He wiped it away quickly. It wasn't from pain, it was from recognition. For once, they understood him. Not the actor, not the man in the robes of Christ, but the man beneath it all. The immigrant son, the servant of truth, the believer. Reporters scrambled to update headlines. Social media exploded. But then, Jonathan leaned toward the mic once more. This time, his voice was stronger, still reverent, but sharper. "Ms. Maddow," he said softly, "today you question my legitimacy. You question my place in this country." He paused, and when he spoke again, it was thunder without volume. "But let me ask you, when you spread disinformation cloaked in intellect, when you manipulate truth into theater for ratings, who gave you the right to stand above the people you mislead?" Gasps. But this time it wasn't shock. It was revelation. Jonathan wasn't just defending himself anymore. He was indicting the system. "You called me a glorified actor, but you erase nuance with every segment. You mock faith. You frame tradition as backward. You stood by while real seekers were ridiculed, and you said nothing." Rachel's face paled, her smile fractured. Jonathan looked directly at her now. "I may not speak the language of elite journalism, but I speak the language of honesty, and it doesn't sound like yours." The room tilted. Neutrality dissolved. The audience wasn't unsure anymore. It had turned. Phones lit up. Live streams multiplied. Whispers spread. Some say Rachel's team even tried to mute the feed, but it was too late. The truth had already gone viral. Backstage, something smaller, yet far more important, was happening. A little girl named Leah sat with her mother in a crowded DC diner, eyes glued to a phone screen. She was no older than 9. They had come from Poland just 3 years ago. Leah, often teased for her accent at school, stared at the screen, her eyes wide. "He sounds like me," she whispered. "And he's not afraid." Inspired, Leah scribbled on a napkin, "Dear Mr. Jonathan, thank you for speaking for people like me. I talk different too, but now I'm not scared. You showed me what brave looks like." An hour later, a security guard passed that napkin into Jonathan Roumie's hands. He read it slowly, said nothing, then gently folded it and placed it into his coat pocket. His hand went to his chest. That napkin said what millions felt. Jonathan hadn't just stood for himself. He had become a voice for the voiceless. Outside the venue, protesters had gathered on both sides of the political aisle. Some shouted angrily. Others held handmade signs. "We stand with Jonathan. Faith deserves a voice. Truth isn't partisan." Inside, the panel no longer felt like a conversation. It felt like a courtroom. And the American people were the jury. Rachel looked around. The cameras were no longer on her. She cleared her throat, picked up her note cards, and forced a smile. "Let's be honest," she said, trying to salvage control. "This isn't about me or him. This is about national discourse." But no one was buying it, because for the first time, Jonathan Roumie wasn't being spoken about. He was speaking for himself. From the back of the room, a quiet voice broke through. "Let him finish." Jonathan turned slowly, eyes locking with the camera again. His presence now filled the entire room. Then he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a navy blue folder. Slim, simple. He opened it and held up a single page. "This," he said, "is my proof." The camera zoomed in, a naturalization certificate. His name, date, stamp, validated. "I didn't buy my way in. I earned every paper, every status, every step with work, integrity, and prayer. He held up a second document. "And this," he said, tapping the page, "is my O1 visa, extraordinary ability in the arts. I didn't get it because I knew someone. I got it because I poured everything into my calling." Then he looked at Rachel. "You've been in power for decades. Tell me, Ms. Maddow, what have you built that wasn't handed to you by someone else's sacrifice?" The audience froze. Rachel's eyes darted left, then right. But this time she had no script, no retort, because what Jonathan had brought to the table couldn't be faked. Authenticity. This wasn't just about him anymore. He was speaking for every misunderstood immigrant, every mocked believer, every underestimated soul. Suddenly, a man in the audience rose. Weathered coat, veteran cap. He spoke trembling. "Mr. Roumie, I'm a Vietnam vet. I've seen cowards. I've seen real courage. And today, I saw you. You may not have been born here, but today you fought like an American." A gasp, then thunder. Applause shook the walls. People stood. Reporters set down their pens. Even security guards wiped their eyes. Jonathan looked stunned. He hadn't asked for this moment, but he had earned it because in a room full of voices, it wasn't the loudest that moved the nation. It was the calm one, the kind one, the one they never expected. Rachel finally stood up, jaw tight, panic in her eyes. She leaned forward toward her mic. "Let's not forget who I am," she said. "I've served in media longer than Mr. Roumie's been acting." A few half-hearted claps followed, but it was too late. Her voice wasn't reaching anymore, because truth had already found another vessel. She looked not like a journalist, not like a leader, but like someone trying to stop a flood with a paper cup. "I've interviewed world leaders. I've challenged dictators," Rachel Maddow scoffed, trying to recover her edge. "I don't get shaken by a television actor." Jonathan didn't flinch. He remained seated, still as stone, graceful, yet glowing with the kind of strength the world rarely notices until it's too late. And then he rose, not in haste, not in anger, but in resolve. His voice, when it came, was as soft as a prayer and just as piercing. "And yet, here you are, shaken," he said, "because truth doesn't wear a blazer or speak in sound bites. It wears humility." The audience exhaled. Some covered their mouths. Rachel Maddow sat back down, silenced once again. She had tried twice to diminish him, twice to define him, and twice he had risen higher than she imagined possible. This wasn't a debate anymore. This was a reckoning. In the press room behind the stage, chaos erupted. Staffers from both teams stood frozen, staring at live streams on their phones. Producers stopped scripting. Cable news anchors went off cue. Even liberal outlets began to whisper what no one had expected. "This isn't the Jonathan Roumie we thought we knew." A hot mic picked up one of Maddow's aides in the hallway. "She's losing it. She completely underestimated him." Meanwhile, backstage, Jonathan slipped away from the lights. Quiet, peaceful. A young intern approached nervously with a tissue in hand. Her voice trembled. "Mr. Roumie, thank you. You spoke for so many of us." Jonathan didn't say much. He just smiled gently and touched her shoulder. A silent benediction. And then something unexpected happened. Rachel Maddow sat alone at her table. Her posture wilted. For the first time in years, maybe, she looked truly uncertain. She stared down as if searching through the wreckage of her own words. Perhaps, just perhaps, she regretted them. But it was too late. Her insult hadn't landed. It had awakened something deeper. Jonathan Roumie had turned mockery into a message, and millions were watching it unfold, second by second. As the summit neared its final panel, the moderator returned to the stage, visibly shaken, tapping his papers with nervous fingers. "Before we close today's session," he said quietly, "we invite Mr. Roumie if he has any final words." The cameras locked in. The crowd leaned forward. Jonathan stood slowly. No notes, no cue cards, just his heart. "I didn't come here to speak," he said, "but I was spoken about in a way that didn't just wound me. It wounded those who came to this land with dreams and dignity." A pause, tears rimmed his eyes, but his voice held strong. "I am a son, a friend, a believer. I came here with hope, and I built a life, a legal, honest, faithful life. And if you think that because I have an accent, or because I once played a role in sandals, I don't belong, look again. This is what America looks like." The room stood still. Some wept openly. Others bowed their heads in quiet shame. "My silence," he added, "was mistaken for weakness. But no more. I will not be silent when dignity is under attack." He stepped back, and in that single moment, Jonathan Roumie ceased being just an actor. He became something else entirely. a voice for the unheard. As he stepped down, his shoes echoed softly on the polished floor. He wasn't smiling, but in his eyes was something greater than joy. Relief. The burden he had carried for years of being misunderstood, caricatured, dismissed, had been lifted. Then, "Mr. Roumie!" A small voice broke through the crowd. Jonathan turned. A boy, no more than 10, stood nervously with a tiny American flag in his hand. His father tried to hold him back, but the boy had already stepped forward. Jonathan crouched to meet him. "My mom's from Serbia," the boy said. "They make fun of her at work. They say she talks funny. But tonight I'm going to tell her she sounds like you." "And that's brave." Jonathan's lip quivered. He took the boy's flag and pressed it gently to his chest. "Your mother is strong," he whispered. "Just like you." The cameras caught it, but the room held its breath. This wasn't politics anymore. This one was healing. While Rachel Maddow sat frozen, silent, cornered, the American people were seeing something they hadn't seen in a long time. A man who didn't shout but changed hearts anyway. Backstage, Rachel finally snapped. Her hands slammed against the table. "Why didn't anyone stop him?" she hissed. "Where were the talking points? Why is he winning this?" But her aides didn't answer. They were watching the live stream too. Some even had tears in their eyes. The tide had turned, and Rachel Maddow knew it. She had picked the wrong target. She thought she was burying a soft-spoken Christian actor. Instead, she had uncovered her own bitterness as her own blind spot. And now, America wasn't just rejecting her words. They were reconsidering the image they had of him. The cold, disconnected label was gone. In its place stood a real man, a believer, a fighter, a light in the storm. Rachel sat in silence, her phone buzzed again and again, but no spin doctor could undo what had just happened. She had poked the lion and the lion had roared. Not in anger, not in noise, but in truth. But then she turned away. No gesture, no eye contact, no grace. The cameras caught every second. And just like that, America saw the difference. One person had just been humiliated, yet responded with dignity. The other had thrown the first stone and still couldn't face the truth. People began leaving the venue quietly, but the real conversation was just beginning. On Twitter, on YouTube, on Facebook, millions were glued to their screens, uploading clips, quoting lines, captioning posts. This is why Jonathan Roumie speaks for us. That handshake she didn't offer said more than words ever could. Truth doesn't need a microphone, it needs a spine. And in the silence that followed Maddow's retreat, Jonathan's voice echoed louder than ever. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the Washington Monument, Jonathan stepped out of the black SUV that brought him home. In one hand, the folded napkin from a little girl. In the other, a tiny American flag from a Serbian boy. His face looked calm, but his heart was full. Inside, a quiet figure waited. President Trump, arms crossed in the foyer. He didn't speak right away. He just nodded. "You didn't just defend yourself today," he said quietly. "You defended every forgotten American." Jonathan didn't cry. He simply nodded back, walked to the mantel, and placed the little boy's flag beside a portrait of the Statue of Liberty. That night, alone in his study, Jonathan scrolled through hundreds of messages from everyday people. "I never liked politics, but today you made me feel something real. I grew up ashamed of my accent. Not anymore. You made me cry, Jonathan. Thank you for reminding us who we are." He looked up from the screen, and for the first time in a long time, he felt seen. Not as an actor, not as Jesus on TV, but as a man who chose grace when the world offered only cruelty. The next morning, as soft sunlight poured into the White House library, an envelope arrived from the press gate, hand-delivered, no return address. Jonathan opened it slowly. Inside was a handwritten note from the elderly veteran who had stood and spoken for him during the panel. "Dear Mr. Roumie, I fought in a war where they told us who the enemy was, but no one prepared us for wars fought with words. Yesterday you won a war, not with bullets, but with honesty. I saw you stand taller than any general. You made this old soldier believe again. In America, in kindness, in you. With respect and tears, James Rusty Dalton, U.S. Army, Remar." Jonathan pressed the letter to his chest and closed his eyes. "Thank you, Rusty," he whispered. There were no cameras to record it, but if there had been, the world would have seen something unforgettable. A tear sliding down the cheek of the most misunderstood man in America. Not from pain, but because, finally, they understood. That afternoon, his phone rang, a private number. He almost ignored it, but something told him to answer. "Hello? A fragile voice answered, "Mr. Roumie, you don't know me, but my name is Elena. I'm 83. I came here from Hungary in 1956. Jonathan sat upright. The woman's voice trembled. "I saw what you did yesterday. You held your ground with such grace. And I wanted to tell you, you reminded me of myself." There was a pause. "For decades, I thought I was invisible. But when you stood there, with that little flag in your hand, I felt like you were standing for me too." Jonathan pressed a hand to his heart, voice thick with emotion. "You are not invisible," he said. "You are part of what makes this country strong." They spoke for only 4 minutes. But in those minutes, 2 souls, 2 generations, 2 languages, 2 wounds found something deeper than politics: belonging. Jonathan hadn't just carried a flag that day. He carried all of them. Later that evening, after a quiet meeting with President Trump, Jonathan returned to his office. There, waiting on his desk, was a red envelope. No name, just initials, MC. Inside, a USB drive and a single note. "What she said to you was cruel. What you said to her was true. But this is what she didn't want anyone to see." Jonathan hesitated, then inserted the drive into his secure laptop. On the screen, verified financial documents, hidden memos, confidential emails buried in archived folders, and a video unreleased of Rachel Maddow mocking him in 2019, calling him America's most successful Sunday school fantasy. Jonathan stared at the screen, stunned. He could release it all, but instead, he gently closed the laptop. "No," he whispered, "I already won." He didn't need revenge. His truth had already cut deeper than any file ever could, and that made him far more dangerous than she had ever prepared for. The next morning, a package arrived from overseas. Brown wrapping, Slovenian postmark, his mother's handwriting. Inside was a hand-carved wooden angel. It held a flag, half American, half Slovenian. Attached, a note. "You left to find a new life, but you never left your roots. Yesterday, we watched our son become the man the world never saw coming. We cried for you, not because you were hurt, but because you stayed kind when the world tried to make you cruel." Jonathan clutched the carving to his chest. The same hands that once folded flyers in a struggling parish now held the hearts of millions. He was never supposed to fight back. He was never supposed to rise, but he did. And now, even those who once mocked him couldn't stop watching. Not because he was loud, but because in the face of hate, he chose to stay human. In a small elementary school in Iowa during current events hour, a teacher wheeled in the TV cart. The 5th graders, all children of immigrants, watched the now viral clip of Jonathan Roumie standing up to Rachel Maddow. The classroom was silent. Then a girl named Maria raised her hand. "He talks like my mom," she whispered. The teacher nodded gently. "How did that make you feel?" Maria hesitated, then smiled. "Proud." Another boy, Daniel, who rarely spoke, raised his hand too. "He didn't yell," he said, "but he made the grown-ups listen." Some clapped softly, a few wiped their eyes. The teacher had prepared a worksheet that day. She never passed it out, because what her students witnessed was bigger than politics. It was bigger than news. It was hope. Later that afternoon, Maria, now back in her small Iowa classroom, sat quietly, her hands trembling slightly. Then she wrote a letter addressed to the White House, folded it 3 times, gave it to her mom to mail. It read, "Dear Mr. Roumie, I want to speak like you someday. I want to be brave too. Thank you for not being afraid of mean people." A letter from a child, a moment in a classroom. Jonathan Roumie's voice had reached even the smallest hearts. That same night in a small church in Tennessee, something rare unfolded. A diverse group of women, black, white, Hispanic, young and old, sat in a quiet circle. They weren't discussing politics. They weren't talking about elections. They were praying for Jonathan Roumie. The pastor's wife, never political, wiped her eyes as she spoke. He didn't insult back. He didn't scream. He just spoke his truth, and it pierced through all of us. Another woman nodded quietly. "It felt like watching Esther," she whispered. "A man placed in the palace, not for power, but for such a time as this." They didn't pray for his career. They prayed for his protection, his voice, his strength. One woman opened her worn Bible. She read aloud, Proverbs 31:26. "He opens his mouth with wisdom, and the teaching of kindness is on his tongue." Phones buzzed silently with alerts, but no one reached for them, because this wasn't about headlines anymore. This was about healing. And in that quiet sanctuary, far from cameras and sound bites, Jonathan Roumie became more than a public figure. He became a symbol of quiet courage, a light that even politics couldn't dim. That same night, Rachel Maddow sat down for a pre-scheduled TV interview, but the chair felt colder than usual, the lights harsher. She looked tired, guarded. Something about her had changed. The anchor didn't hesitate. "Do you regret what you said to Mr. Roumie?" Rachel gave a half smile. It didn't reach her eyes. "It was a poor choice of words," she said, but the anchor leaned forward. "Or was it a window into how you really feel?" Rachel shifted. "Look, I've dealt with the right-wing media for a long time. Maybe I got emotional, but I never expected him to push back like that." The audience was silent. Then came the soundbite that would sweep across the nation by sunrise. "You underestimated him." Rachel looked away, then looked back. "We all did." 3 words. That's all it took. We all did. It became the headline on every major news site, because now even the one who tried to silence him had admitted it. The lion had roared, and he would never be ignored again. The next morning, Jonathan Roumie received an invitation to speak at the National Unity Breakfast, a gathering meant to heal the divide between media, leadership, and the public. He almost declined, but something in him whispered, "Go." As he entered the grand ballroom, people stood, not because they were told to, but because they wanted to. No music, no production, just silence and respect. Even critics, even cynics, rose from their chairs. He stepped to the podium. His voice wavered at first. "I was born in a quiet town. I never imagined I'd stand here. Not as an actor, not as a man of faith, but as someone who had to remind this nation, kindness is not weakness." He scanned the crowd. "You may question my accent, but please don't question my heart." Tears. "I came here with nothing. I built my life, brick by brick." That's not just an immigrant story, it's the American story. Some wept openly, others bowed their heads. Rachel Maddow was not in the room, but her words had already been replaced by something stronger, by grace. As Jonathan stepped away from the microphone, a soft tug on his sleeve stopped him. He turned. A little girl, 6 or 7, stood there in a wrinkled yellow dress. She held a crayon drawing in both hands. She didn't speak much English, but she looked up shyly and said, "This is you." Jonathan knelt. On the paper, a figure standing on a stage surrounded by hearts, stars, and a cross. The girl whispered, "You brave." Jonathan hugged her gently, holding back tears. Then he signed the drawing, handed it back, and whispered, "So are you." The cameras caught it, but it needed no caption, because in the middle of a ruthless storm, a moment of pure innocence had reminded the world what truly matters. That girl didn't understand policy. She didn't follow media, but she understood bravery, and she saw it in Jonathan Roumie. That night, Jonathan walked alone through the White House garden. Beneath a soft moonlight, everything, the applause, the letters, the whispers, settled on his shoulders. He wasn't angry. He wasn't proud. He was at peace because he had proven something eternal. No matter how powerful someone may appear, no one has the right to humiliate another soul. And he hadn't fought back with fury. He had fought with facts, with faith, with love. Donald Trump met him by the fountain. "You didn't just speak," he said. "You made them feel again." Jonathan nodded, then whispered, "Sometimes the loudest message comes from silence that finally chooses to speak." Across America, the moment replayed over and over. People cried, people cheered, people changed. Jonathan Roumie had been misunderstood, underestimated, and mocked. But in one unforgettable day, he rewrote his story, not with noise, but with heart. And Rachel Maddow, she never tried to shame him again, because even lions know you don't wake the quiet one unless you're ready for their roar. Dear viewer, if this story moved your heart, if it made you cry or helped you see someone unexpected in a new light, like this video. Leave a comment. What part hit you the hardest? Subscribe for more stories where kindness speaks louder than hate. Together, let's make the quiet voices unforgettable. Thank you for watching Storytime with Green.